Well, it's a real privilege to be with you here this morning, and I want to thank you for this opportunity of spending a little time with you. I have never been to Montana before, and so this is a new experience. I have been to about 165 countries around the world, but never to the country of Montana. I do welcome all of you to the country of Wyoming. And when we were in Lambeth, at the Lambeth conference this last summer, I invited all of the other bishops that I met to the country of Wyoming because it is as other as one could find in the United States, I felt, which is actually, interestingly, why I love it so much, because so much of my life has been spent as a minority. And in some ways, I'm a minority in Wyoming, which made it very easy for me to adjust to and acclimate to. And so we're loving it. We've been there about 18 months. Bishop Marty asked me to speak on something related to a theme, I don't know if I need that anymore, about building bridges with the other. And of course, for the other, in most of my life, it has been my Muslim sisters and brothers. And so I'm going to share a little bit about what has come to kind of be my approach to relating to them. And it can translate principle-wise to many the others. For me right now in Wyoming, it happens to be our Native American sisters and brothers. And I'll share a little bit about that throughout this. 6 pillars builds a bridge, embracing the other in the way of Christ. Lessons from living as a Christ follower in a Muslim context. Growing up in Senegal, West Africa, when you need wisdom and counsel, the tradition is that you go to an elder, someone with white hair, or gray hair. Some of you qualify in this room, meaning someone with life experience. And when they answer your question, whatever it is, they more often than not share a proverb. And so one of the proverbs I grew up learning in the language of Wolof, which is the main trade language in West Africa, goes like this. Soame hade tugolo sat ngemba dutakmuk. And it means this. If you have a monkey for your friend, you'll never get your loincloth stuck in a tree. Meaning, it's who you know at critical moments in time that makes all the difference. And when we're talking about this very important subject here, which I think is immeasurably important, and all the more so in the day we're living in now, we know that one person we do have on our side is our Creator, because all are made in the image of God. And so I think it's very apropos that we begin with a prayer. I know we've had morning prayer, but we're going to do a different kind of prayer now. Let's stand. And put your hands out like this a little bit. Don't worry, this is not some kind of charismatic or Pentecostal thing. You know, I love how we Episcopalians sing, we lift your hands, but no one lifts their hands. Have you noticed that? And but we're going to pray a prayer in Arabic. And it goes like this. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It means, in the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate. It is the first line of the Holy Quran. And any Muslim leader, if he was here speaking right now, he would always begin, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, asking God's blessing on that which he's about to undertake. Actually, on a more practical basis, you'll often hear them say it before they climb a stepladder to change a light bulb, just to be safe. But in a very real sense, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. You may be seated. Growing up, I spent my first 18 years of my life in Senegal, West Africa, which is a Muslim country, about 98% Muslim. We lived in Tunisia, North Africa, where I served as the rector of St. George's Episcopal Church there, in Tunis, Carthage. We spent 10 years in Cairo, where I served as the rector of the International Episcopal Church there. I moved from Qatar, Doha, Qatar, in the Persian Gulf to Wyoming. Talk about going from the Middle East to the Wild West. And then I have spent a lot of my life working throughout the Islamic world, from Mauritania all the way to Malaysia, with the Episcopal Church and faith-based publishing and various relief and development organizations. So I've spent most of my life in a Muslim context. I'm 58 years of age. Someone, when we were investing last night, they said, "Oh, you're so young." And I was like, wow. That's wonderful. I'm almost 60. I don't know what that says about the Episcopal Church, right? But at 58 years of age, I think I've spent all of my life, with maybe the exception of 15 years, in a Muslim majority context. So, and I have to tell you, the only people I know that would step in front of a car for me without even thinking twice, in other words, give their life for me, are my Muslim friends. That's how close those relationships are. Therefore, I have a great respect for Islam as a religion and a profound love for my Muslim sisters and brothers, who number among my closest friends. Personally, as a Christian, as a Christ follower, and we're going to differentiate a little bit between those two a little later, and as an Episcopal bishop now, I am passionate, of course, about the teachings and the person of Jesus, or in Arabic, we would say Isa. However, I should point out not necessarily always the Jesus of the church or the Jesus of Christianity or the Christ of Christianity. And I'll share a little bit more about that later. And as my Muslim friends, in truly loving me, wish me to follow the revelation that Muhammad received, I, in turn, in truly loving them, want them to experience Jesus' character and benefit from the transformational nature that I've experienced of Jesus' life, on my own life, but without all of the sociological and religious and cultural and political and historical barriers that exist. And my, do they exist. Both faiths at core, when they're faithful to their tradition, are missional. I remember when one of the former archbishops of Canterbury came to Cairo when we were living there, George Carey. And they were having a big interfaith dialogue meeting, and he was there sitting at the main table with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, which is the intellectual and the spiritual heart of Sunni Islam. About 90% of the Muslims are Sunnis in the world. And Sheikh Tantawi, the Grand Imam, they were sitting there together, and as they both shared, all of a sudden there was this awkward moment of silence, because they each realized, one to the other, that they wished the other to convert. George Carey, our archbishop, wanted the Grand Imam to become a Christian. And Sheikh Tantawi, the Grand Imam, wanted the Archbishop of Canterbury to become a Muslim. It would have been fantastic for the British tabloids. And after this awkward moment of silence as they're looking at each other, then they broke out in hysterical laughter, because it's fantasy. It would never happen. But it shows the missional nature of both. So all of this led me on a lifelong journey, and it started early for me. Growing up in Senegal, West Africa, as a Christian minority within a Muslim majority context, my closest friends were Muslim. But as a teenager, I would often see, especially among the adults, the all too often tension and distrust that existed between the two. Additionally, I remember missionaries there in particular, whose focus was on trying to introduce the Senegalese to Christianity. So to put it another way, they were there to convert my best friends. And sometimes it would happen. But when it happened, they'd be immediately ostracized from their family. They would have all their opportunities for work, let alone higher education, and some of them were brilliant, were be gone. They would go through a period of great psychological confusion, having no respectable identity per se in their context. And to say it colloquially, they ended up getting Jesus, yes, but the rest of their life was hell. And I remember thinking, something's wrong here. Hence, this became a personal passion for mine as to what it means to relate to the other in the way that God intended for us to do. And as a Christian, put differently, what does it mean to relate to our Muslim brothers and sisters in the spirit of Christ? Or how does the Christian faith walk the Muslim road? Of course, there are many barriers to overcoming all of the distance between the two. But in my experience, they are almost always cultural or historical or economical or sociological, as opposed to belief-based or theological, which so many people think they are. Obviously, with all that's happening in our world right now, the building of bridges between Christians and Muslims has become all the more important. It's interesting, the latest Gallup poll, the most discriminated group in the United States right now is not our African American sisters and brothers. It's not our Native American sisters and brothers. It's not our Jewish sisters and brothers. It's still our Muslim sisters and brothers. It would be so helpful if we had a guide or some kind of a guidebook to take this journey of building bridges. And as the side that suffers most in terms of erroneous stereotypes is that of our Muslim brothers and sisters, I think looking to their tradition to guide us is very apropos. And it's also a way of honoring them. Now, we're all aware, or most of us probably, if we know anything about Islam, that it's known the world over for its 5 pillars. They're practices of faith. The Shahada, the Creed, prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage. However, for this morning, for our conversation, I'd like to add the 6th practice. It's a word that we've heard a lot about ever since 9/11 in the media, albeit greatly misunderstood, and it's the word jihad. And in effect, I would propose that the challenge put before us by the context of the world that we live in, and certainly by the teachings and the Spirit of Christ, which we as Christians say we follow, is to return to our Muslim sisters and brothers these 6 demonstrations of their faith, albeit in a different manner. I believe they provide for us a guide to approaching Islam and to our Muslim sisters and brothers that's effective and that's authentic to the spirit and teachings of Jesus. 6 pillars builds a bridge. And you may want to write these down. I'm also going to mention a few books that you might find of interest. So I just mentioned that in case you have a pen or a paper ready. The first is the concept of jihad, which is too often associated, of course, in Western eyes with great tragedy and violence, suicide bombers, Islamic extremists and fundamentalists, or the Islamic conquest of the 7th and the 8th centuries. Of course, in the Holy Quran, jihad primarily means an internal struggle. In Christian terminology, we call it spiritual warfare, denoting a spiritual struggle, the wrestling, if you will, and an inner wrestling toward the way, the intention, the desire of God in one's life. It's a beautiful concept. And in light of all of this, I would say that as Christians at this time, we also need to be in a jihad, in a struggle of a different sort in regard to Islam. And I think it can best be described as we need to proactively wage peace on Islam. We all know that there's continuing and growing discord, of course, between some Christians and Muslims, with an all too often Islamophobia existing, even in the media, even in the more progressive media in our country. Rarely is there a wonderful, positive presentation of a Muslim. I believe we need now more than ever to be involved on an all-out effort to help them, not conquer them, with goodwill and appreciation and love and sympathy and empathy at times and prayer. How many times have we prayed for them in our prayers of the people? Seeking to eliminate everything that creates any further alienation, always advocating a peaceful approach. and one that is entirely non-confrontational in nature. And for those of us of Christian background, which I think most of us qualify in here today, this means more than ever, I think, that we need to focus on demonstrating the teachings of Christ. Let our Muslim brothers and sisters see Jesus as opposed to primarily focusing on talking about Jesus or about our faith, which is what so much of interfaith dialogue is all about, the impartation of knowledge one to the other. During this whole personal pilgrimage of mine, I was profoundly influenced by a book that I found during a trip to India once. I was stuck there. My flight was canceled. I had an extra 3 days, and I discovered this book titled The Christ of the Indian Road. It's written by E. Stanley Jones, the Methodist missionary who was a close friend of Mahatma Gandhi. And in the book, he focuses on how Christ walks the Indian road, albeit in a Hindu context. And he describes the role of Mahatma Gandhi in all of this. As you may know, Gandhi was captivated by the person and teachings of Christ and profoundly influenced by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which formed his whole philosophy of nonviolence resistance. And as a result, he was known to be, because he was a follower of the way of Christ, a defender of the minority Muslims in India, which is why he was assassinated by a Hindu militant. Western Christians in India would come and they would sit at Gandhi's feet and they would ask him what it meant to live like Jesus more effectively within an Indian context. And I love the scene when Western Christian leaders came to Gandhi and they asked him, how can we more effectively communicate this Jesus figure to Indians here in India? And Gandhi's first answer was, I would suggest, first of all, that all of you Christians begin to live more like Jesus Christ. And in many ways, a Hindu Gandhi Christianized unchristian Christianity. Did you follow that? And a whole non-organized Christ following arose in India apart from the church because he helped Indians visualize how Christ walks the Indian road. And I'm reminded of the counsel Gandhi gave to Western Christians in India. Don't talk about it. The rose doesn't have to propagate its perfume. It just gives it forth, and people are drawn to it. Live it, and you will come to see the source of your power. And they will come to see the source of your power. I think of the experience of St. Francis of Assisi, who we're all about, of course, to celebrate soon. In 1219, when he came to Egypt during the height of the Crusades, the Crusaders were fighting the Muslim majority on one front, and Francis came on another front. And he came to meet the Sultan Kamal of Egypt, who was the nephew of the great Islamic military leader Salah ad-Din. And Kamal, the Sultan, had never seen a Christian like this before. The only Christians he knew in terms of coming from the West were those fighting on the front. And Francis came in peace and in humility and in love, and he was taken with Francis. They spent three days together. And when he left, he invited Francis to send all of his missionaries, they were known as the Little Brothers, to bring him back, and they can serve all throughout their land during the Crusades. And Francis went back to Italy and he wrote those wonderful words that many of us know by heart. Preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. But they come out of a Muslim context. Historically, Christianity has more often than not taken an argumentative, confrontational, or apologetic approach to Islam, trying to show at times that ours is a better religion, for that matter. But from a faith perspective, it is not representative of the way of Jesus. Instead, I think we should model how Jesus related to the Samaritans of his day, whom you may call the Muslims of Christ's day. The Samaritans shared the same religious story as the Jews, the same prophets, they had the same holy places, but they had differing interpretations. And yet Jesus refused to wage any tension on them whatsoever. In fact, when you think about it, every time he mentions a Samaritan, they're always the heroes of his stories. And remember, Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman at the well gives us one of the most beautiful stories of grace and love in the Gospels. A well-known Arab writer that I know has a beautiful way of describing the encounter between Jesus and that Samaritan woman as two thirsty people who meet at a sacred well, who meet and journey together. In other words, they both needed each other, albeit for different reasons, and they gave to each other. The second pillar, the creed, the Shahada. La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammadur Rasul Allah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. All you have to do is say that in front of an imam, and that's what it takes to convert to Islam. It is the essence of Islamic belief. And within the theme of belief, I think we need to have primarily as our focus, more than anything else, building on all of the commonalities that exist between Christians and Muslims. The way I like to describe it, I'm going to use green here, by the way, because green is the color of Islam. And why? You see all the Islamic flags? Why are they green? This is more humorous. Because they believe Muhammad's favorite color was green, just so you know. But what's the Islamic symbol of faith? The crescent, right? So, crescent. The crescent, of course, is that part of the moon that we can see because of the reflection of the sun. But whenever you see a crescent, the majority of the moon is dark. And for the sake of an illustration, so we'll move it over here just to see here as well. For the sake of an illustration, I would suggest to you that this little sliver, the crescent, is what we have different from our Muslim brothers and sisters, theologically. But the dark side of the moon, the majority, is what we have in common. And the challenge for us, like never before, is to build our relationships with the other on the dark side of the moon. A la Pink Floyd. You remember that? We're too often blinded by the constant illumination of our differences that we can't see all that we have in common. And in the midst of this increasing chasm of discord and misunderstanding, I think our day calls for a whole new kind of movement. Not of religious unity, certainly not of belief, certainly not one of cultural uniformity, but one that very simply is about building on what we hold in common, consciously. Building on all the commonalities and similarities, from their traditions, the liturgical postures, and I'll talk about that in a moment, to so much of the theology, monotheism, one God, the Creator God, the God of Abraham and Isaac, the authority and the respect they place in Moses and all of the Hebrew prophets, their desire to fulfill God's goals of justice and mercy, just like we do, their view of life as sacred, and certainly on their mutual respect for Jesus. As Muslims historically have seen him as the origin of the Gospels, which they call the Injil. They believe in the virgin birth. Do you realize today, percentage-wise, more Muslims believe in the virgin birth than Christians? One of the paradoxes of our day. They call him the Messiah. They believe in his return and the second coming. As the renowned Professor Tarif Khalidi, a Muslim formerly of Cambridge University, now at the American University in Beirut, Lebanon, wrote in that wonderful book, The Muslim Jesus, in Islam, there exists a preoccupation with Jesus that is unique among the world's non-Christian religions. Islamic culture presents us with what in quantity and quality are the richest images of Jesus in any non-Christian culture. No other world religion known to me has devoted so much loving attention to both the Jesus of history and the Christ of eternity. I do a lot with the arts, and I'll mention that in a moment. I'm going to show you an image here. Interesting experience that we had in September 2016. In Jordan, a well-known journalist of Christian background, Nahad Hatter, was assassinated in Amman, and that is something very rare to take place in Jordan. After that, one of the artists that we work with, Hilda Hieri, who's a Jordanian artist of Muslim background, felt there was a need for a whole new bold project to bring attention to Jesus' teachings on peace, a Muslim painting of a portrait of Jesus. In celebration, or in collaboration with the celebrated North African Tunisian poet Anis Shushin, who is also Muslim, the result was this powerful portrayal of Jesus with a profound message. Anis wrote a poem that specifically was for this portrait of Jesus and came to Jordan from Tunisia to actually handwrite the poem in Hilda's painting, and it's the poem that's in the halo there. The poem by Anis Shushin, loosely translated in Arabic, is this: Jesus, O Son of Mary, the temple of love and humanity is destroyed. We became half human, and the peace is being stoned with the stones of war. Evil has aggravated in the hearts, and goodness in front of us is defeated. O Christ, the world has become so ugly. Injustice to us continues unabated, while justice in us is slaughtered. The world is getting smaller in our eyes, and there is no longer a meaning for us, O Jesus. Earth is becoming all death and hunger, and darkness is settling deep in our souls. And we need your light to be lost in us, O Jesus. And we need you to come back. The sons of Adam betrayed all oaths and crucified the souls of his brothers and tied up love with chains. But before you come back, tell your and our beloved Muhammad to come back with you. Tell him that man has walked in the road to perdition. Tell him that the rest of mankind, that the sons of Adam, have fallen into a trap. See what they are doing in your name, O Jesus. The painting was first unveiled on Facebook with a tremendous response all over the Middle East, thousands writing in, saying that Jesus' message of peace is needed more than ever. Religious leaders, priests, and imams encouraged it. It was not, this is all just on social media before it was actually publicly displayed. The Grand Mufti of Jordan said, yes, we all need you, Jesus, to come back and bring us peace. The painting then went on, the next slide here, to be on public view in Amman, and Queen Rania, the queen there, was the first to visit it. Just an example. When I often give lectures throughout the Middle East and North Africa to Muslim audiences, I focus on Jesus as the guide on peace building. And very often, especially young people come up to me afterwards and say, thank you so very much for highlighting Jesus for us. Because within Islam, there has been a de-emphasis on Jesus over the centuries, ever since the Crusades, because the Crusaders came in the name of Jesus. Many of the mosques all throughout the Middle East, prior to the Crusades, were named after Jesus. And now they're more often than not after some of the Hebrew prophets or the Islamic saints that have come since. And I want to say a word here about Sufism. Sufis, the mystics within Islam, are particularly sympathetic to Jesus or Isa, calling him a prophet of the heart. For Sufism is known for its flexibility and its wide variety. And during the history of Islam, Sufis like Al-Hallaj and Zahra Wardi and Rabia and Ibn al-Arabi and Hafiz and Baba Tahir and Jalal ad-Din Rumi, which many, of course, of us know in the West, they've tried to interpret Islam in fresh ways, focusing on a different concept of approach to God. Because their aim is union, oneness with God. And interestingly, much of Sufism bears resemblance to Christian mysticism. For example, it has been said of Ibn al-Arabi, the 13th century Sufi mystic, he is a man for this time because he has his foot in every camp, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. And he is the one who wrote, the person who catches the disease of Christ cannot be cured. I love that. I think of Al-Khalaj, the 10th century Sufi martyr who loved Christ, tried to identify with him, choosing Jesus as his model, and even choosing, when sentenced to death, to be crucified like Christ. And he was in Baghdad in the 10th century. On a contemporary level, in 1993, when living in Tunisia, I met someone who profoundly illustrates this focus on Jesus, following Jesus within an Islamic context. His name is Mazhar Malouhi. He's a celebrated Arab novelist and Arab author and best-selling novelist who himself has been profoundly impacted by Gandhi's passion for Jesus. He's originally from Syria. He's of Muslim background. He actually traces his heritage to the line of Muhammad. You can go into their living room and you'll see this large genealogical tree, and it will go all the way back to the Prophet himself. He's now living in Beirut, and his life and books have been this powerful force for peace and healing among Muslims and Christians throughout the Arab world. And he is someone who now, at the age of 85, would call himself a Muslim follower of Jesus. His own story is fascinating. He had a spiritual bent, right, as a young man from the beginning, and his family put him on track to be an imam. And they sent him to a Quranic school run by the Muslim Brotherhood, a very conservative brand of Islam that actually started originally in Egypt. And what they presented to him was unattractive to him. The God they presented, Allah, which is simply the Arabic word for God, was too transcendent. He said, as a young man, I would picture Allah or God up in the sky, lying down, smoking a shisha, a hookah pipe, having thrown to the world a book, the Quran, and leaving the world to suffer on its own. And so he began his own spiritual quest. And later, when he was starting to be a fairly well-known young poet, he was doing his Syria military service time on the Golan Heights, which at that time still belonged to Syria, belongs to Israel now. And he was given a copy up there of Gandhi's spiritual autobiography, and this is the second book I want to highlight for you. It's titled The Story of My Experiments with Truth. And all throughout, Gandhi talks about Jesus in it, and Mazhar was introduced to Jesus through Gandhi. And so Mazhar then sought out a copy of the Gospels, which Gandhi, of course, quotes all throughout. Reading it through, and without any link to the church or Christianity whatsoever, he decided to commit his life to following Christ and the way of Christ. In fact, at that time, he didn't even associate that Jesus necessarily with Christianity. And interestingly, Syria's population is 10% historic Christian. But he was tremendously disillusioned with Christianity. First, he saw it as a Western oppressive tool colonizing them with blind support for Israel. Not a small thing for Syrians. And secondly, he was totally unimpressed with the two Christian families that lived in their hometown of Salamiyah. One ran the liquor store and the other ran the prostitution house. Not so exciting maybe for a young man, but not for a young man searching spiritually. And Mazhar Malouhi's life journey has been to bridge this chasm of misunderstanding that exists between Christians and Muslims. And as I mentioned, he calls himself a Muslim follower of Christ. He more often than not now calls himself a Sufi Muslim follower of Christ. Islam is my heritage, he says, but Christ is my inheritance. And bridging his Islamic faith with this profound importance to him of Jesus' teachings about how we should live and treat the other is what he's given his life to. I remember when I was writing a book on him titled Pilgrims of Christ on the Muslim Road, I was interviewing him in the Tunis souk in the old Medina. We were sitting there and he was drinking that thick black Turkish coffee. Some of you call it mud. You don't dare stir it. And smoking a shisha, the hookah pipe. He's fingering his Islamic prayer beads. And he's speaking to me of the sweetness of Christ. And it was beautiful. It's contagious. And I remember going back to my hotel room that night saying, oh God, I want what he has, because he's experienced something I have not yet experienced. Today, he's recognized and respected by Sunni Muslim authorities, including the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, which is the intellectual and spiritual heart of Sunni Islam, and even having relationships with senior leadership in Shia groups like Hezbollah. And he often goes into the mosque and he teaches from the Gospels about Jesus, with many sitting around him, including imams who, as a result of Mazhar Malawi, have devoted themselves to following and teaching the way of Christ. Mazhar's uniqueness is that he presents to us a voice from the other side, an insider's voice. And he's not only is he from a Muslim background, but he's also captivated and devoted to the person and the teachings of Jesus. And Mazhar Malawi's resulting approach to Islam has much to teach us as Westerners, and more specifically, those of us who call ourselves Christians, on the journey of building on what Christians and Muslims hold in common with this Jesus figure. We can even, of course, build on in what we hold in common with their 5 pillars: fasting, pilgrimage, charity, creed, and prayers. So many of the early or the ancient Middle Eastern Christian traditions formed the special foundation for the basic practices in Islam. The Muslim form of prayer, with its prostrations, I can't because my back go down too low, prostrations and bowings. Where does that come from? It comes from the ancient Syrian Orthodox tradition. And it's still practiced in pewless churches throughout the Levant today. The month-long fast of Ramadan is an Islamization of our Lent. And some Middle Eastern Christians still practice the all-day fast. Same could be said about pilgrimage. They go to Mecca. What was one of the main reasons the Crusades took place? We couldn't get to Jerusalem. It was so inherent in our spirituality, pilgrimage to us. The creed, La ilaha illa Allah. There is no God but God. What was the first Christian creed? Does anybody know? What's the first Christian creed? Very short. 3 words. Jesus is Lord. It is a creed of practice, not of belief. Because if Jesus is Lord, then he's Lord of one's life. After that, a little while later, another creed developed, which we had this morning, the Apostles' Creed, which is 3 short paragraphs. It has nothing to do with practice, how one lives your life, about following in the way of Christ. It has everything to do with belief. And then a little while later, in the 300s, evolved the Nicene Creed, which is also 3 paragraphs, but 3 times longer than the Nicene Creed. And it has everything to do with belief and nothing to do with following in the way of Christ. And then a little while later, another creed developed, which we have in the back of our prayer book, the Athanasian Creed, which is 3 times longer than the Nicene Creed, all about belief. We could never say it in church. There would be no time to celebrate Holy Communion, let alone give a sermon. And what's Muhammad doing? After all of this, it developed already. He's going back to the ancient Shema in the Hebrew, naming the character and the nature of God throughout the day several times. Prayer, 5 times a day. Where does that come from? Benedictine tradition. Morning, we have it, and of course, in our Anglican tradition, morning prayer, noon prayer, evening prayer, night prayer. Very few really practice it all the way through anymore. But it comes from us. Prayer facing the holy city, Mecca. Do you realize that every single church in the world, pre-1950, even in the jungles of Africa, when you sit on a log, where are you facing? Symbolically facing Jerusalem. We're all linked. The architecture of the earliest minarets, square instead of round, come from the church towers in Byzantine Syria. They originated out of us. And while most Western Christians don't know this, interestingly, our Muslim friends usually don't know this either anymore. And there's no question that if a 7th century Christian came back today, he or she would find much more in common with the worship practices of Muslims than our own worship tradition, which they wouldn't even recognize. In other words, our starting point always needs to be to discover the similarities and see the redeeming values in the other. For from this foundation, everything changes in how we see the other. And in the Middle East, we hear a lot about the famous Arab hospitality and how important for us it is in turn to demonstrate that. Well, I would suggest it's far more important for us to exhibit the guest posture. Not focusing on being a host, but focusing on being a guest. Because when we're the guest of someone, we submitted ourselves to them. We've put ourselves at their disposal. We put ourselves in a state of vulnerability and humility. The fundamental characteristic of being a guest is that you're willing to receive from the host. Remember the story of Jesus and Zacchaeus. We all learned in church school, if you grew up in church school. Every imaginable barrier is up, preventing Zacchaeus and Jesus from connecting, and certainly from Zacchaeus seeing Jesus. Social, cultural, economic, religious, physical. He was a wee little man, right? What did Jesus say to Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus, can I come to your house to eat? Can I be your guest? And we need to, in effect, allow ourselves to be the guest of each other, allowing ourselves to learn from each other. It is a posture that breaks down the barriers. Rumi said, this being human is a guest house. And I'm reminded of that beautiful statement related to all of this from St. Ambrose of Milan, who baptized St. Augustine of Hippo. All truth, no matter where it comes from God's Holy Spirit. And the challenge for us is to build on the truth in the other. Thirdly, the pillar of fasting, or in Arabic, Sawm. During the Islamic holy month of Ramadan, of course, from sunrise to sunset, and it's a beautiful time if you've been in the Middle East or in a Muslim-majority country during Ramadan, of charity, of contemplation, of celebration. Of course, the idea of fasting, when you think about it, is quite simply withholding from something, giving something up, a letting go. And I would propose that now more than ever, both Christians and Muslims need to let go of this concept, albeit subconscious, of the Christian faith being a Western-oriented faith and Islam a Middle Eastern-oriented faith. Both are Middle Eastern in origin, as is Judaism. And it's so important for us to remember, or we lose our true sense of identity of who we are and where we come from. Christianity began as a Middle Eastern faith. It's only due to the accidents of history that the gravity of Christianity moved to the West. Christianity has suffered from this ailment, interestingly, much more than Islam. For example, most Muslims around the world today, the vast majority, maybe 80 or 90% of Muslims around the world, do not speak Arabic. Such as the most populous Muslim nation in the world, Indonesia. The second most populous Muslim nation is India. Even West Africa, where I grew up, no one spoke Arabic. However, all Muslims see their faith as very much Middle Eastern in origin. Of course, it helps the fact that the Quran can only be recited in Arabic, so it reminds them of where it came from. But regardless of where they are around the world, the Middle East is still their first point of cultural reference when it comes to their faith. And in contrast, while also most of Christianity now is not Middle Eastern, whether it be Western or Korean or South Asian or Latin or Chinese or African, we have forgotten our Middle Easternness in origin, or at least we don't honor it and give it its due respect. And it's critical for us to recognize and emphasize the Middle Eastern origin and nature of both faiths as we relate to each other, because we both come out of the same place. And more specifically, just as a stream takes on the coloring of soil over which it flows, so Christianity, in flowing through the soils of different ethnic, cultural, and national outlooks, takes on coloring from them. Hence, a good deal has been added to the teachings of Jesus. And as a result, in regard to Jesus today, many people, Western, Christian, and Muslim, perceive him as a Westerner with not much connection to Middle Eastern culture, and yet Jesus was a full-blooded Middle Easterner. And as for Christians, the challenge is to effectively strip Christ of these Western trappings that have grown up around him over the centuries and see him again as one who was born and lived and died and rose in the Middle East, returning him to his cultural origins, a Jesus who first walked the Middle Eastern road. And in this sense, it's Jesus the Middle Easterner that we all follow. And it's critical that we always remember that we are always seeing Jesus as cultural outsiders. I remember a young Omani Muslim man from the Sultanate of Oman telling me after he read this book, which is Mazhar Malawi, that man I was telling you about, he published this. It's called An Eastern Reading of the Gospel of Luke. He's representing the Gospel of Luke in Middle Eastern fashion for today. And it's beautiful. You could say it looks like the Quran. It's got the borders around it, and then there's commentary in the back. And this young Omani man said when he read it, it read like a letter written from home to him. And this challenges Western Christians to always assess, I think on an ongoing basis, if we're following the Jesus of the Gospels or the Jesus of a specific Western religion that has grown up around him. Because if anything's true about our faith, it's true because of Christ, not because of Christianity. Something, of course, Jesus had nothing to do with. Jesus wasn't a Christian. I love that powerful short story by Khalil Gibran, the early 20th century Lebanese artist, poet, and mystic from a Christian background, who so beautifully bridged East and West. And he wrote, once every 100 years, Jesus of Nazareth meets Jesus of the Christian in a garden among the hills of Lebanon. And they talk long. And each time Jesus of Nazareth goes away saying to Jesus of the Christian, my friend, I fear we shall never, never agree. This also relates to our sacred scriptures. Interestingly, most Muslims, see the Bible as Western, or at least as foreign, even when it's in Arabic. It smells of the West. The way it's presented, the way it's published, and all the associations with it. And of course, Westerners, we think of the Holy Quran as an ancient Middle Eastern religious book. And yet the Christian and Jewish scriptures, what we call the Bible, are quite simply, really, when you think about it, a collection of many different Middle Eastern books put into one volume for us to be able to carry around, 66 of them usually. It's far more complex in its Middle Easterners than the Quran. It's written in 3 Middle Eastern languages from a vast expanse of Middle Eastern culture, using a variety of Middle Eastern literary genres and culturally steeped in all parts of the ancient Middle East. We all come from the same place. Fourthly, the pillar of prayer, salat in Arabic, praying 5 times a day facing Mecca. And prayer is ultimately about putting ourselves in a certain disposition toward God. When you think about it, a certain attitude. It's in aligning ourselves to God's intention of how we should live. What Christ called living the kingdom of God. And when those Western Christians came to Gandhi and they asked him, how can we best live like and communicate our Christ to Indians? After telling them first, try living like Christ, He then said, second, I would suggest that you practice your religion without adulterating it or toning it down. To Gandhi, this in essence meant fully embodying Christ's Sermon on the Mount, which Gandhi said went straight to his heart when he read it, and formed much of the basis of his life, teachings, and practice. And at the core of the Sermon on the Mount, it entails a sacrificial approach, one of kindness, selflessness, forgiveness. Ultimately, it's about Christ's second greatest commandment, loving our neighbor as ourselves. And in the Middle East, this does, of course, mean hospitality. For as a wonderful Arab proverb says, the guest is a guest of God. And one of the best ways to love or to be hospitable is by honoring the other, in this case Muslims, and their culture, which leads to the idea of integrity. For honesty and integrity need to be always the pillars upon which we build our relationships with the other upon, such as our Muslim brothers and sisters. And that mandates total authenticity, having no hidden agenda. As an Arab proverb says, you can't carry 2 watermelons with one hand. In other words, our relationships must be fully authentic ones, not with the hidden agenda of changing the other. On the individual level, Mazhar Maloui has observed that followers of Jesus and his way within Islam have traditionally been encouraged by Christians to break away from their Muslim communities. Same thing that happened with Native Americans here in this country. His own Syrian Christian friends encouraged him early on when he met some, and they discovered he was following this Jesus figure. They encouraged him to become culturally Christian and leave his Islamic culture. They encouraged him to take a Christian name. Mazhar Maloui is a Muslim name. To stop praying as he did. Don't use your body when you pray. That's what Muslims do. To cease fasting. Start using Christian Arabic terminology. Don't say salamu alaikum. Say salam lakum. It means the exact same thing. But Christians say it one way, Muslims another. To stop attending his family's religious celebrations, to keep his distance from mosques and Muslims, and to really prove he'd crossed over the line, to eat pork and alcohol in public. But he came to realize, of course, that following Jesus' teachings doesn't mean joining another religion. It doesn't require taking a Christian name or using the symbol of the cross, which the early church did not use, or changing the day of public worship, or adhering to a different style of worship within a church building, or eating different foods, or drinking alcohol, or using images of Jesus, which most Muslims do not use images of their sacred figures, or ceasing to fast, etc. Mazhar loves to tell a parable to those Christians who feel that Muslims who desire to follow Jesus' teaching should leave their Islamic culture and practices. And it's a little parable about a monkey who's swinging on this tree, and the tree happens to be overlooking a pond or a lake. And the monkey looks down and he sees these fish swimming. And he catches them one by one and he hangs them on the tree. And someone comes by and they see the monkey doing this and they say, "What in the world are you doing?" And the monkey, with all good intention, and mind you, great enthusiasm, said, "I looked down and I saw the fish drowning and I'm saving them." But little did he know, he was killing them and killing them quickly. You could apply this 100% to our Native American sisters and brothers. Openness and honesty and honoring the other are always the ways of God. The fifth pillar, the pillar of charity, zakat in Arabic. And unlike our tithe, they have 2.5% of all of someone's savings is supposed to go to charity. But for this, I'm talking more about the need to demonstrate charity. And this relates to showing our love for the other by loving what the other loves. Westerners often think that they really can't get far without knowing Arabic if they're working with Muslims and relating to them. Mazhar Maloui has always said, yes, learning Arabic is helpful, But language is always second. Loving them is first. Gandhi, when Western Christians came to him, asked him about all that, how can they more effectively communicate Christ? The third thing he said was, I would suggest that you put your emphasis on love, for love is the center and the soul of Christ. And one of the key ways we show this is by loving what they love, loving what they hold dear, which is very often their rich culture, such as their literature. Read Naguib Mahfouz, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1989. Read Adonis. Read Abdul Rahman Munif. Read Amin Malouf, Taho Hussein, Yaha Haki, Tawfiq Al-Hakim. They're all available in English at Barnes & Noble or certainly on Amazon. Islamic cultures have cherished storytelling for centuries, and they have this long and rich literary history. And in regard to faith, stories are especially powerful in the Eastern tradition, and therefore culturally are one of the most effective mediums through which to address issues of peace and harmony and respect and faith. After all, Jesus, a Middle Easterner, was the master of the short story. And I encourage Westerners to also love their dance, their music, their food. If you're in the Middle East, and I'm taking a pilgrimage soon of Wyomingites, I'm going to encourage them to enjoy the shisha, their hookah pipes. In other words, always focusing on minimizing the differences, building bridges. And it means cultivating this profound sensitivity of trying to always see things through their eyes. Loving their understanding of community. The individual within Arab and Islamic cultures is only important as he or she belongs to a community called the Ummah. There's an Arab proverb that says, don't tell me who you are. Tell me who your friends are. Love their films. Everyone here should see Omar Sharif's last great film, Hassan and Marcos. And it's done with this marvelous Middle Eastern comedian, Adol Imam. And you'll be in stitches. Or take that marvelously profound, wonderful interfaith film titled Where Do We Go Now? By the Lebanese director Nadine Labaki. Won the People's Favorite Award at the Toronto Film Festival. Love and understand their visual art, especially their contemporary art, because it speaks to where they are and what they're trying to address at this time. And I've got to tell you, we have found that the arts can be one of the most effective mediums to build bridges with the other, whoever you want to say the other is, to enhance understanding, to bring about respect, to enable sharing, and certainly to deepen friendships between them. As Khalil Gibran, the author of The Prophet, said, we have forgotten, or have we, that there is but one universal language, and that its voice is art. The arts can help us put ourselves in the other's shoes. They help us cultivate a profound sensitivity, trying to see with their eyes. Tomorrow in Lander in Wyoming, we open with an exhibition of 15 premier Native American artists from 8 indigenous American tribes in and around the Great Plains. It's called Grounded. It's what we can learn from them about our interconnectedness to the earth and everything that lives on the earth, wildlife and humanity. It's a way we receive from them, and we are simply, as the diocese, the catalyst toward giving them a platform to benefit the rest of the world, because we need their worldview and spirituality during the environmental crises that our world is going through. And it will tour Wyoming, and then it's going to tour the United States, and then it will go to England, and it will end up in the Middle East, interestingly. I'm going to show you a painting here by Yasser Rostrom, who is one of the more well-known surrealist painters in the Middle East. He's Egyptian. I'm going to read you a statement that he writes about this piece of work, and I'd encourage you to look at the art as I read the statement. The base of this bridge is the very tree of life that all humans have come from. At the center of this tree of life are Adam and Eve. The branches coming out of the tree represent those of all religions, whether known and declared, like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, or unknown religions which are represented by the empty branch. Whatever our religion, we are all seeking the light, the divine being, or God. I've been inspired in this part by Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. The love between Adam and Eve is not a love out of choice, but a love out of need. They need each other to survive. They are both part of the same tree. In the painting, they are each covering the other's genitals. They are protecting each other. Like Adam and Eve, all humans need each other. With our faults and differences, we need each other to survive. The black background at the top of the painting represents my extreme sadness at the current situation of the world and all the wars and atrocities committed in the name of faith. He's a Muslim. I think that kind of says it all. Time and time again, we have seen the words of the 14th century Sufi Persian poet and mystic Hafez to be true. Art is the conversation. Art offers an opening for the heart. Art is at least this knowledge of where we are standing in this wonderland. We are partners straddling the universe. And so the arts can become encounter points, if you will, encouraging new friendships to be made across religions and spiritualities and cultures. I am personally passionate about much more than interreligious dialogue, something that's very in vogue and trendy, as you can imagine. But I am much more passionate about interreligious friendships. But they're much more difficult to bring about because it involves the investment of yourself in the other. Loving what the other loves minimizes the differences and builds bridges. As Mazhar Maloui says, the light we see from the stars at night come from stars that are far away. These stars may no longer be in existence, but their light still shines on us. Even so, the memory of Western Christians lives on with Muslims they knew and loved, even if they are no longer there in person. The final pillar is the pillar of pilgrimage. The Hajj to Mecca, required by all Muslims to visit Mecca at least once in their lifetime, if they have the financial means to do so. It's deeply moving to hear from those who have taken the pilgrimage, but how spiritually inspiring it is to them. And for a Muslim having made the pilgrimage to Mecca, instead of viewing themselves as having accomplished that pilgrimage requirement, ticking it off the list, they instead see that pilgrimage to Mecca as being the beginning of their most intense phase of pilgrimage toward God for the rest of their lives. And when they return from pilgrimage, they have a title. El-Hajj Yusuf, El-Hajj Ahmed, Hadiji Marwa, Pilgrim Paul, Pilgrim Susan, Pilgrim Mark. It's a beautiful concept. You know they've been on pilgrimage, and they are officially now a pilgrim. And I think it's critical that when Christians and Muslims relate to each other, that we see ourselves first and foremost as pilgrims on a journey and not having arrived. So much of our faith teaches us that we arrive. Certainly the creedal emphasis of our faith breeds a sense of finality to it. It puts borders around it. But I think it's much more accurate to say that we are all people of pilgrimage. For a pilgrim is someone on the move, always journeying, and therefore open to asking others for directions of how to get there, meeting new people, even asking for Christians even asking Muslims to help us on our journey of trying to live the life God desires us to live through the teachings of Christ. Mazhar Maloui, when he goes into a community, he goes to the senior imam and he gives them a copy of the Eastern reading of the Gospel of Luke, and he said, I'm a follower of Jesus, and I'm asking you to read this gospel, and if you see anything in here in my life that contradicts what Jesus is teaching. I want you to hold me accountable. Help me in following the way of Christ. It's a certain attitude or spirit of openness, of gentleness, of willingness to grow in our spiritual journey, regardless of what or where it comes from. When we lived in Carthage in Tunisia, I fell in love with the mosaics of early antiquity. And I often see this all really like this beautiful divine mosaic with each little chip, each little piece being a different cultural expression of the faith. And the whole portraying the beauty of God as nothing else can. And it's only in the continual learning from these many faith and spiritual expressions that our own faith can be made most complete. There's a poem in the book of Psalms, the Zabur, as our Muslim friends, who that is one of their holy books, are Psalms. It's known as the Pilgrim Psalm, Psalm 84. And right in the middle of that psalm, it says, "Blessed are those who have set their hearts on pilgrimage." And in this sense, all of this has been and continues to be a pilgrimage for me toward seeing God with new eyes and experiencing a freshness in my own spiritual journey that has been beyond beautiful. Now, I could talk to you for another 2 hours, but I think I will close now, and maybe if there are just 5 minutes of questions. Any questions at all?
Yes.
Please.
Faced with Christian nationalism on one side, where do we position ourselves to try to create conversation?
Yeah. I mean, one of the great others now in our country are what we have termed Christian nationalists, right? Of course, in Wyoming, we've got a lot of this as well, even in our churches. I don't know if you have that in the churches here in Wyoming. You do. I still say that relationship is everything. Relationship is everything. I am only who I am because of experiences I've had with the other. Non-threatening, undefensive relationships. And so I have to tell you, I sit there often and hear things and resist sharing, but slowly work toward perhaps giving them an experience of something other. The only hope for anyone changing, including myself, are the experiences that we have that shape us. And it's also taking the long picture. I have to tell you, one of the most, we as the Episcopal Church pride ourselves of being all-embracing and generous and inclusive and all of that. I got to tell you, in many ways, we are just as narrow in our progressiveness. And the world's much bigger than that. And what was the beautiful thing about Lambeth is that, of course, the majority of the Anglican Communion would be more conservative than we are as the Episcopal Church. And initially, to see our House of Bishops, many of them, even there were some ones expressed, I don't even know how to relate to them. What do I say to them? Because of their views on LGBTQ plus issues, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of 2 weeks, it was wonderful to see exchanging cards, relationships, in our little groups, people experiencing a spirituality, a depth of commitment. These bishops having no reason you would ever want to be a bishop in South Sudan. You ask them how they're doing their visitations. Maybe they can get on the back of a moped, maybe, and drive 8 hours. Their families have to live in other cities because there's no place for them to live where they actually serve in their see. I mean, when you talk about that kind of commitment to following the way of Christ, it shames us. We have a tremendous amount to learn from everyone. It does not mean we agree with everything. So my experience, at least in Wyoming, is mingle, 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 and hold my tongue when I need to. Yeah. Yeah. This coming time is just to the Holy Land, but spending a lot of time in the West Bank. Yeah.
And then the second one, how do you spell Mazar?
Mazhar, M-A-Z-H-A-R, Maluhi, M-A-L-L-O-U-H-I. Pretty much nothing is in English, though. It's all in Arabic. So, and he does that purposely because he talks so much about Jesus. He's afraid Christians will latch onto it and Christianize it. And then, of course, its potency is gone, right? So even Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, asked me if he's got a book. It looks similar to this. It's called a Sufi reading of the Gospel of John, because John, of course, is the more mystical of our Gospels. And Rowan wanted it translated into English because we can benefit so much from it. But Mazhar resisted because he thought it would be labeled, and he didn't want to label it in that way.
So what would be the definition of Christianity?
I love how the first Christians were called. Followers of the way. What way? The way he lived, the way he taught, the way he demonstrated. I love that. Followers of the way. And of course, the word Christian originally comes from little Christians. They were so Christ-like of following that way that people called them Christians. Those are like little Christ walking around. We've got a long ways to go, don't we?
Have you put together a reading list, or could you put together a reading list
Of books and
books,
sure.
the writings
Sure.
that you have described?
Sure. Yeah, I can send that to Bishop Marty, And I'll put those films in there as well, What we're doing as a diocese increasingly is having diocesan film screenings. So we encourage watch parties in churches. I mean, it's a party. And then we do a little intro, and then we screen it live. So we're all watching it together. And then afterwards, every church or community have questions to discuss, and it's a little bit of a dialogue. And of course, we make sure there's wine there as well. Yeah.
Do you have any way we can listen to your lectures or read some of what you said?
Yeah, well, I've written a few books, and you can look on Amazon and get those. My most recent one I would encourage is the one I wrote on Khalil Gibran, because so many people know about the prophet. You remember that. But so few know about him and his spiritual journey. And he starts in a very narrow, kind of exclusive, stereotypical type of an environment. Very, very narrow, I would say. And he journeys his life into this all-embracing spirituality, but ends up, the last big book of his life, his best book, is titled Jesus, Son of Man. It's all about Jesus. And some kind of view it almost as like a fourth gospel, but it brings to life the person of Christ in new and fresh ways. So, and that book's titled, what's the title of my book? Let's see, what is the title of my book, Marnie?
Pilgrims of Christ.
No, not that one, the one on Gibran. I can't even remember. It slipped my mind, but it's my most recent book.
What is your opinion of Seville?
Sabeel and Naim Atik. Yeah.
Because I've met Naim, I'd like you to give a plug for Seville.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Sabeel. And it's Naim Atik is a Palestinian priest, and at one time they thought he might be the next bishop of the diocese. But he started a marvelous organization, which back during the liberation theology movement, which started, of course, in Latin America primarily, he found this and was attracted to it and put it within Palestinian framework, and has been marvelous. And of course, he's got family members here in the United States as well. He's getting up there age-wise, but a very special person. So,
Your book is In Search of a Prophet.
In Search of a Prophet. A Spiritual Journey with Khalil Gibran. Thank you for reminding me what I've written, you know. And actually, they're bringing out a version of it because next year is the 100th anniversary of the Prophet. And it came out in 1923. And outside of Shakespeare and Lao Tzu, it's the most popular book of poetry that's ever sold. And Michael Curry is writing the foreword, and that comes out next week. So there's a paperback version coming out soon. It comes out next year.
Academic question, what's the name of Jesus in Arabic?
Isa.
Isa?
Isa. Yeah, Isa. Yeah. And it's interesting, where I grew up in Senegal, many of my friends were called Isa. Of course, you see this in Latin America a little bit too, right? You know. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Bishop, do you have any observations or recommendations for lay leaders and clergy leading and capturing this energy of Christ followers within the context of like a local parish where it often seems like it's, Sunday Eucharist, very rigid and a little bit, I sense sometimes it lacks the energy of like this pure divine love that we're talking about that transcends cultural context and it speaks to so many people.
Yeah. I think one of the strengths we have, which is also happens often to be our prison and weaknesses, is I do think as Episcopalians in our tradition, we understand how to tap into and can tap into spirituality that connects with a lot of where people, especially the younger generation, is at. Not dogma, not rigid traditionalism, but creating an ambience of spirituality, of contemplation. And there was H.A. Williams wrote a marvelous book. He was a theologian in the UK, and he was really a prophet. And he predicted, I think he died in 89 or something like that, but he taught at, I believe, at Cambridge. But he said that the only churches that will exist 100 years from now are those that have become centers of contemplation. And I think around this person of Christ, there's a lot of room for that. I do think it means really thinking outside the box. I have to tell you, when I saw the list of all of those beautiful people who passed away this last year, I was asking myself, are they being replaced in our churches? And if they're not, we have a calling to think differently about what it means to take the core of who we are, these seeds, this wonderful foundation we have in our tradition, and how do we represent it and repackage it for a new generation? And if we don't, it's going to be a sweet end, but we have to. And it's our challenge right now. And as much as we have been blessed and ministered to in this tradition ourselves, we have to acknowledge that the way we currently do it, it often does not connect with the next generation. And we cannot become that kind of mega church, evangelical church down the street. But we can become something different that is based in those things we have strengths on, albeit repackaging it. And that's our challenge.
Where is the Native American art exhibit that you're?
It will open, tomorrow it opens in Lander, which in our state, and then it will travel to next to Casper, and then Cheyenne, and then Jackson, and then Worland, and then in Rock Springs, and then it will go to Washington, D.C., a few other places around the United States, and then we'll go to London on Trafalgar Square at St. Martin in the Fields, and then Leicester at Leicester Cathedral, and then it'll end up in Dubai. So.
Last question.
What brought a person with such a world experience as you to Wyoming?
Do you know what? That was the question I was most often asked, as you can imagine, as I toured around the state. Well, I had the experience of the former bishop was a friend of mine, so I knew a little bit about Wyoming. We did used to live in Colorado Springs, which is not too far away, so I'm slightly familiar with Wyoming, though Colorado and Wyoming are very different. And then in 2016, I was giving a lecture, I think in DC, about related to one of these exhibitions that we had related with Muslim artists and some Jewish artists all from the Middle East. And we were taking them to give people an experience of the other, this tour. And someone said, why don't you go to Wyoming? It's the most anti-Muslim, anti-Middle Eastern, and anti-Arab state in the United States. So I love that challenge, right? And so here we go. And so from 2016 to 2019, maybe, I took a number of exhibitions and we toured Wyoming with Arab artists and some Jewish artists, enabling Wyomingites to have the opportunity of meeting individuals from this other tradition. And I've got to tell you, they were only received with tremendous magnanimity and warmth and welcome. Very special. But it gave them an experience of the other. So it allowed me to get to know the state a little bit, and it allowed them to get to know me a little bit. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, I am taken with the calling we have to build bridges with our Native American sisters and brothers. And there have been many, many promises that the Diocese of Wyoming has given over the years that we have not lived into, that the time has come for us to do that. And so that's another perspective. And I remind the Wyomingites that when I'm in the Middle East and I told them I'm coming to Wyoming, what is their response? It's always, oh my land, you're going to one of the most exotic places in the world. So we often don't see how the other sees us. And I do feel I'm in one of the most beautiful, exotic, and special sacred places in the world. I was just going to close after that with a Sufi blessing. Would that be okay? May the blessing of God rest upon us. May the peace of God abide with us. May God's presence illuminate our hearts now and forevermore.